remotely. Welcome to all of you. So I turn to item number 2, Mr. Sewell Carlson, please.
That South Huron Committee of the Whole approves the agenda as presented.
And a mover, please. Moved by Councillor Neeb, seconded by Councillor MacLeod-Haggett. Any discussion? Call the question, all in favor? And that carries with 6. Thank you. Disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof. Are there any disclosures at this time? Not seeing any reports, and we welcome our friends Selena and Denise from the county to begin. Please proceed when you're ready.
Great. All right, get going here. Yeah, so good afternoon, Mayor Finch and members of South Huron Council. Thank you for the opportunity for Denise and I to discuss with you this afternoon the ongoing 5-year review of the South Huron official plan. So this meeting provides us with an opportunity to share with Council the actions of this project completed to date. We plan to share our findings from early consultation with the community and ideas stemming from these conversations. As well, we will dive into the projected growth and lands needs analysis that helps us determine whether or not there is sufficient lands available to accommodate residential, commercial, and industrial development in the municipality. And finally, we'll also take the opportunity to share early recommendations for settlement area boundary considerations and go over next steps in the project. So here's a visual of the project timeline just to orient ourselves. Council will also note that this is outlined with a bit more detail in figure 1 of the staff report. Council will recall that staff was directed to proceed with the official plan review and begin community consultation at the Section 26 meeting, which was held on March 27th. And so throughout the months of April and May, we have gone out to the community and agencies to ask key questions pertaining to the official plan related to growth and development in South Huron. So after sharing our initial findings with Council this evening, it is anticipated that staff will proceed with crafting a first draft of the revised official plan to present to Council in July. From there, it's anticipated that open houses will be scheduled and advertised to present the draft more broadly throughout the community, with the Lakeshore open house in August, specifically in order to catch seasonal residents along the lakeshore, and the remainder being booked for September. Additionally, we anticipate notifying residents of large land use designation mapping changes through a postcard mailout at that time. And then in accordance with feedback received during the open houses, staff will plan to bring back a further revised draft to Council in October, and then we'll seek to proceed with scheduling a public meeting for December. So our goal is to have a document that Council finds suitable for adoption by February, with approval from Huron County Council sought in March. So at this point in time, this project does remain on schedule. So April and May, as mentioned, largely consisted of ambitious but successful early consultation with the community and relevant agencies and public bodies. There were a handful of what we refer to as focus group meetings held with targeted audiences, and that included the Perth Huron Builders Association, the Exeter Business Improvement Area, the South Huron Chamber of Commerce, Eco Exeter, as well as the Kirkton Woodham Optimist Club this evening. In addition, there were themed community tables that were scheduled, and that was with the intention of allowing the public to attend one or multiple sessions that had a focus on items or geographic areas that they were most interested in. Further, the municipality did have a booth at 2 of the Exeter farmers markets throughout the month of May for general consultation. Agencies or public bodies that we directly consulted with included the Asabo Bayfield Conservation Authority, Lambton Shores planning staff, as well as Three Fires Group on behalf of Chippewa of Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. So in addition to the feedback received at these sessions, we have also received comments in writing from community members, and we are scheduling one-on-one discussions with community landowners as requested. It was lovely as well to get to speak with councillors who did attend one or multiple of the community tables, and we do appreciate your keen participation in the project. So what is it that we heard during this time, and how do we think it can tie into the official plan review? So more broadly speaking, there were definitely themes and comments that were consistently mentioned at many, if not all, of the meetings. So as it pertains to housing specifically, the community does recognize that wages are not keeping up with the rapid increase in housing costs in South Huron. Folks are observing a loss of rental stock availability within community and concurrently an increase in short-term rentals. There is increasing housing pressures within the community, and as opposed to what was perhaps the case in prior years, there is a visible homeless population observed within the communities in South Huron. Folks noted that as retirees continue to move into South Huron, there is an increasing demand for what we sometimes refer to as soft services, being medical services, recreational services, etc. When we consider agriculture, folks are continuing to see the ongoing consolidation of farming operations, which is being exacerbated by rising farmland values and increased foreign and developer interest. When thinking about the environment, the community recognizes that we are facing more frequent high-intensity rain events, and they are seeing the lingering impact of the emerald ash borer on our local woodlots. South Huron residents recognize the increased diversity happening within the community. And finally, folks are noticing the lingering effects of COVID-19 on local businesses and communities. They've noted that we aren't back to the way things once were, rather we're navigating how things will be moving forward. So those were just some general comments that came up consistently throughout the consultation process. I'll move forward now with talking about more specific items raised during the various community tables held, and we'll begin here with the housing table. So housing affordability was by far the most referenced concern we heard throughout the consultation process. And the community noted that they want to see more various forms of affordable housing to accommodate all members of the community, with additional residential units being viewed as a creative, affordable solution. The tradition of building primarily single detached residence is not seen by these members as being the solution to the housing crisis. Rather, building in and up through higher density and infill instead of out is desired, both from an affordability and a climate change perspective. Mixed uses and walkability were seen as leading to higher quality of life within South Huron communities. And the community sees housing and employment as strongly interrelated, being that employers need to provide housing and residents need to find a place to work. We did utilize the community tables to undertake consultation as well regarding the community improvement plan that the municipality is working on. When asked their opinions on various proposals for CIP funding, something that we heard at this table was that folks consulted were not necessarily in favor of CIP funding for additional residential units. And kind of the comment was that they saw that as using taxpayer money to help private landowners make a profit. Rather, there was much more of an interest and favor of CIP funding for downtown revitalization that was seen as being more beneficial to the whole community. So I'll just note that as that relates to that project as well. We do believe, based on these comments, that we should ensure that the housing official plan policy framework requires building up again and not out onto farmland through requiring minimum density thresholds within South Huron settlement areas. We do see opportunity to incorporate community design policies to strengthen support for the built environment considerations that do impact health, active transportation, quality of life, climate change adaptation, community safety, etc. We also suggest that consideration should be given to permitting fourplexes as of right in fully serviced residential areas. We believe the policy framework should permit and encourage creative housing solutions that allow for more affordable options, such as the adaptive reuse of former community facilities for housing and mixed-use buildings. And that's certainly something that we have been seeing in South Huron to date as well. And finally, we do think that there is opportunity to increase support for greater heights of residential buildings within Exeter and surrounding Grand Bend. So that was sort of a summary of the housing table findings. As it pertains to the natural environment table, it was noted that there needs to be a more accessible explanation as to how natural environment lands are identified in South Huron. We believe that this can be addressed through an updated introduction to this section in the plan, and so that comment was certainly noted. Participants in this table did note a desire for the municipality to identify and protect urban and natural environment areas. We did note that the County of Huron's Forest Conservation Bylaw does apply to lands outside of settlement areas, but the topic of urban natural environment areas was definitely of interest for residents participating in that table as well. Folks did recognize that much of the natural space within South Huron realistically is privately owned, and so they did support financial incentives for landowners wanting to complete stewardship activities, recognizing that what's good for that landowner is good overall for the community when it comes to natural environment. Participants also view cycling trails and active transportation as an opportunity for climate change mitigation through potentially reducing car trips. So more broadly, as it pertains to climate change specifically, the group also emphasized the importance of more mitigation-focused policy as opposed to adaptation-focused. So the thought here was that mitigation would focus to reducing the risk of climate change impacts as opposed to adapting to it as or after these impacts occur. So from this conversation, the thoughts of staff was that we think that climate change policy needs to be incorporated throughout every section of the official plan, not just being natural environment specific, because realistically, there are relevant impacts of climate change on all land uses within South Huron. We also think it is appropriate to include a reference in the natural environment section to the Huron Clean Water Project and public support for farmers as stewards of the land, as mentioned there. So during consultation now moving forward with Lakeshore residents, we did hear mixed opinions on whether a secondary plan is necessary for what has been historically referred to as the Port Blake settlement area, or planning area, I should say. There was definitely more of a consensus that the area is distinct from the remainder of South Huron and does require more specific policy framework for growth. Most folks were in consensus that they are not in favor of increased development, or sorry, of any further development west of Highway 21. And that's largely due to the sensitive natural environment areas as well as flood-prone regions we find west of the highway, as well as just the existing character of that existing development. There were certainly concerns expressed as well about developing further east of Highway 21. The concerns included, the existing traffic congestion issues, the carrying capacity of local beaches to accommodate future residents and visitors, the lack of active transportation infrastructure within the area, loss of farmland, loss of natural areas, and just a lack of medical services and community spaces for gathering and recreation. There was at the time some support noted for more mixed uses east of Highway 21 to kind of meet some of those aforementioned service demands. So things like doctors' offices, medical buildings, that was something of interest to the residents in that consultation. We did as well hear support for consideration of growth along Highway 81 or Grand Bend line and Mollard line directly east of the shared Lambton Shores South Huron border. And so when we look at the screen here, I'll maybe flip to the next slide to provide a bit more context here, but this is the existing mapping of the Port Blake planning area in the official plan. And what's interesting is that the areas shown in beige on this map, most of which are located east of Highway 21, are actually designated agriculture. And I think this map can be a bit misleading in that it appears as though this is a settlement area boundary, when in reality, much of this land, specifically east of Highway 21, is designated agriculture. And so something that we are proposing as part of a shift in thinking potentially with this official plan review is thinking about, rather than a Port Blake planning area, more holistically, a greater Grand Bend planning area, taking into consideration not just the lands north of Grand Bend, but also the lands potentially east of Grand Bend as well. I'll just refer to Denise at this time to see if she has anything further to add on that topic.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about a little bit later in the agenda about the growth that's occurred in Grand Bend over the past 10 years. But just to be aware, Lambton Shores has reached sort of the South Huron or Huron County boundary line on the east end. And so I think that there's more of an interest in seeing lands brought into a formal settlement area and not a planning area. So there is a difference between those two terms. This would be a formal settlement area where development would be directed to. And I would let council know the southerly of those two parcels, we have received a request from the landowner asking that those lands also be considered. So that was certainly the idea of looking east of Grand Bend was shared with the community at the Lakeshore community table. And I certainly say there was a lot of nods in the room that they thought that that was a reasonable place to contemplate future growth.
Thank you. Just to summarize a bit further what we heard at that specific table, participants did recognize that the Lakeshore area does accommodate a large population of retirees, and the feeling was that people should not be forced to leave the area in their final years of life. And so accordingly, there was support noted for having assisted living options along the Lakeshore area. And finally, I'll say there was some concern expressed about erosion of dune environments along the shoreline, sort of going along with that climate change discussion that we heard at the natural environment table. So in response to some of the comments heard at the Lakeshore, our suggestions are that a special policy area to guide development along the Lakeshore be drafted in lieu of a secondary plan. And the thinking here is that this would provide a specific policy framework for residential and mixed-use development, as well as open space areas in the area. So when referring to mixed-use development, we're thinking specifically of high-density residential, commercial, and community facility development that can facilitate the establishment of services needed to support residents, such as trails, restaurants, dentists, medical offices, as noted, and gathering spaces. The policy area could, for example, be as specific as requiring an integrated community trail in any new developing area with connection opportunities for future development. So moving on from the lakeshore discussion, sorry, there's a couple more comments here that I should note as well in terms of additional lakeshore ideas. So we would also, as referenced earlier, suggest that council consider growing along the east side of Grand Bend, as well as potentially the north side of Highway 21 in those special area policies. And we suggest that this be accommodated, as Denise mentioned, by a bit of a shift of thinking in terms of going from the Port Blake planning area, which includes lands within and outside the current settlement area boundary, to including owning, referring to the designated settlement area boundary as the Greater Grand Bend settlement area. So we do suggest that the policy framework adequately consider cross-border growth with input from Lambton Shores staff, if that is to be the direction moving forward. So moving on to our Exeter community table, we did hear, similar to what we mentioned earlier, that residents in Exeter do support the idea of allowing fourplexes as of right. They are also in favor of encouraging housing above downtown retail stores and for CIP funding to incentivize same. There is a desire, as mentioned earlier, for mixed-use neighborhoods in Exeter and just a more vibrant downtown in general. We heard that folks do believe future growth should occur along the east side of Exeter. Specifically, the lands referenced would be those north of Huron Street, which are sort of outlined in the yellow there for council's consideration, just east of the existing settlement area boundary. Areas identified in Exeter as having room for improvement by residents did include attracting and retaining businesses and development-ready industrial lands. And I should note that the issue of development-ready industrial lands is not just a topic that's been brought up in official plan consultation, but also by folks just generally inquiring with building and planning on a more regular basis, certainly. So with regard to these comments, staff are suggesting that an inventory of publicly owned lands in South Huron be revisited, and that would be to determine if there's any additional lands that can be made available to the market. We are suggesting that based on the comments received that fourplexes again do be permitted in fully serviced settlement areas where infrastructure does allow. As well, promoting a less auto-dependent future through promoting transit, reducing parking if possible based on the recommendations of the ongoing municipal parking study, and creating active transportation linkages we believe should be encouraged in the policies. And kind of further to what we were talking about earlier, we do think we should be encouraging building up and not further out. So through more compact form, that would allow for more affordable housing from an infrastructure perspective. It would save adjacent farmland and it would promote walkability. So I'm getting close to the end here, but I do want to touch on what we heard at the rural settlement theme table. At this table, there was a significant concern expressed more geographically specifically about the vacant housing stock in Huron Park and the general loss of rental stock within that particular community. More generally, folks noted that housing affordability through the smaller communities in South Huron has certainly brought in new families and has allowed for a bit of a changing demographic in recent years. And with that, there does appear to be an increased service demand that's not necessarily supported at the moment. So again, such as those soft services like medical services, etc. However, the group did indicate that they do want to continue to make strides to ensure that South Huron remains a welcoming community for all. Loss of farmland was top of mind of interest for these folks. Participants want to see that the investment in water, wastewater infrastructure made in South Huron's more rural communities is used to its full capacity. They also did see an opportunity for trail extension along the unused GEXR or Goddard Exeter Railway rail line, and that would be in former Stephen Township as potential asset to the rural communities. Participants noted there is really a lot to enjoy about living in rural South Huron. That included the proximity of beaches, clean water, industry, prime agricultural farmland, wide open spaces, and just a slower, more relaxed pace of life. And participants noted that there is a lack of information about cultural heritage in the area. There was one participant in particular who was newer to the Crediton area and noted that it was difficult for her to find out about the history of Crediton and to know kind of what the community was like prior to her arrival. So out of this conversation, we do believe that there is possibility in pursuing further discussion with GEXR regarding their rail line that goes south from Exeter to the South Huron municipal boundary. We also believe we should ensure that any settlement area boundaries are made with farmland preservation and protection of the agri-food network as a main consideration, as well as maximizing servicing investment and creating opportunity for new development within South Huron's smaller communities. We also think that there is an opportunity to enhance the community-wide policies of the official plan to support cultural heritage interpretation, as well as placemaking opportunities. And finally, similarly to within larger communities, we do think there's opportunity to ensure new development in smaller service settlement areas includes a mix of residential and commercial or service space to help facilitate service provision in South Huron's rural areas. And finally, I just want to talk about the topic of agriculture as it relates to the community consultation and the official plan. This was a widely discussed topic, not just at the rural table, but certainly at all the community tables. And additionally, you may see me sneaking out a bit early tonight to consult specifically with the Kirkton Woodham optimists. But the consultation process has sort of allowed us opportunity to make residents more aware of the recent changes that South Huron has undertaken through their official plan and zoning policies, specifically as they relate to the agricultural policies. Our thought as staff is that we think the agriculture policies realistically are in pretty good shape at this time and are working well. And we don't see really much of a need for a ton of changes when we think about sort of what's been implemented in recent years being, allowing the additional residential units, allowing the opportunities for on-farm labor, and sort of the various points that are noted on the screen there. So the consultation acted as a bit of a great opportunity to just share with local residents what opportunities are available to them as of right. And that was certainly noted by many. So that really summarizes my portion of the presentation in terms of talking about what we heard from the community. So happy to answer any questions of council at this time before I turn it over to Denise to talk specifically about the lands needs analysis.
Any questions from members of the committee of the whole? Councilor Oak?
Yes, thanks, Mayor. Just going back a few slides, but the first one, the last part you talked about on agriculture, the point about 100-acre minimum farm size. Just could you sort of elaborate on that? I know that's currently there's lots of 50-acre farms, and the county has a minimum after a severance of 19 hectares or 48 acres or whatever minimum after a severance. So I'm just wondering about that 100-acre minimum point in there, I guess.
Yeah, so no changes proposed to that policy. It's sort of that general understanding that where we have hundreds, the idea is that we don't want to further break them or fragment them into 50s. But there are certainly situations where 50s already exist on the landscape, and that's perfectly fine. The surplus farm dwelling severances can come off the 50s based on your current policies.
Great. Thank you. And I'm a big proponent of building up and as opposed to building out when it comes to using less land for sure, and fourplexes and those kind of ideas. I guess the question is the official plan going to also address the parking that goes associated with that kind of strategy as well? Because we sometimes run into issues of whether there's enough parking available for what we're proposing, knowing that yes, it might be an apartment, but that doesn't mean that there's going to be any less cars than what a single family dwelling is going to have. If it's a 3-bedroom apartment and a 3-bedroom home, we could be dealing with the same number of cars that family has. So just trying to wonder if that's going to be part of this plan as well.
The official plan is a broader policy level document, so it certainly won't be going into the specifics of parking needs, but it will speak more generally to the idea of providing sufficient parking to meet the needs. It would be in the zoning bylaw, so in the implementing amendment that would implement sort of the policy changes from the 5-year review, they then need to be integrated into the zoning bylaw, and in order to become applicable law. And so that is where we would see those numbers actually changing in terms of what would the parking requirements be, all of which would be informed by the municipal parking strategy. And that study, we understand, will be available later this fall.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, questions? Councillor Vaughn.
Yes, I'm not sure if this question belongs with Selena or it's coming up with Denise, but since we sort of went over a bit about early ideas and what we heard at the Lakeshore, and there was a map, and you started talking about the greater Grand Bend area, not to be confused with the Port Blake planning area and all of that. I'm trying to synthesize, what are you talking about? So I look at this map, and there is a lot, that map would be on page 10, I guess, of the PowerPoint. And it shows an awful lot of agricultural land. And so I'm just trying to read ahead in terms of what are you actually proposing here?
Well, that's a fair question. So the Port Blake planning area, in terms of planning, it's a bit of an oddity within the South Huron official plan, and quite frankly, within any other official plan in Huron County, in that we don't include planning areas in an official plan. So this area is relevant in that it's certainly been an area that's been looked at historically from servicing perspective. So when EAs have been done over the past number of years, looking at water and wastewater servicing, this is the area that was looked at. So it may still be very appropriate to include a map quite similar to this in an appendices, but what we'd like to very much clarify within this 5-year review is that this area does not represent a settlement area and shouldn't be considered in the same way. So what we're looking to do, the other problem with a map, quite frankly, is the bigger the maps get, the less we can see the detail. And so if we were to expand this map, if you imagine at the sort of the southeast end of this map, or sort of the bottom right, we would then be potentially adding additional lands that would be coming into the settlement area around that. Yep, thank you, Selena. So the areas outlined in yellow are the areas that are under consideration at this time. So it would get to be a very large map. And so from a mapping standpoint, what I'm anticipating is that we might actually have 2 schedules for this area. One would be more focused around Grand Bend. It would be called the Greater Grand Bend. And then we would have a north portion, which would be primarily west of Highway 21, and the few properties on the east side that are actually designated within the settlement area boundary. And that would be continued to be called Port Blake, which is more of the historical connotation, right? Port Blake was the area historically referred to as the area at the intersection of County Road 83 and Highway 21. So it would be broken into 2 maps.
Okay, so one of those maps would basically be a map that we're not even looking at so much tonight. Like, you did flash up a little map there. But you're right, you can't see the detail of the area that you're talking on. So I'm thinking about, yes, there are 2 distinct sort of areas. We're talking north from Grand Bend along the Highway 21 corridor. We're talking potentially east out Highway 81, the Mollard line. I don't know, Beeline maybe. There's a couple of pieces up in Greenway, which is quite out of the Grand Bend area. So are you envisioning like 2 different sections for the greater Grand Bend area, or is that what I heard?
Yes, that is what you heard me say, 2 separate maps that would define the different settlement areas. There might be slightly different policies, but I do think they'd be more similar in the sense that we're looking at this geography in the sense of how might these 2 areas grow over time. It's possible that we would see, we contemplate growth both going north. So from the area that's, I'm going to go back to the last. So this is the area that's highlighted in blue. So the what was formerly referred to as Trident, now Soul Haven, those lands there, the or the former golf course, looking north to lot 4, would that area possibly be contemplated for a settlement area expansion? And then, as we said, the areas going out Mallard Line. So those are the areas that are being contemplated if a settlement area expansion in Grand Bend is in fact necessary.
Okay, so just to be a little more clear, specific, I'm gonna go lot 5, lot 6, lot 7, and then the Gore Road lot, whatever lot that is. It's not necessarily being talked about, it's that being settlement area.
Correct.
Okay, because I am aware of the environmental studies
Mhm.
that have transpired over the years. But those had a totally different need, and they're more than 12 years old. And so when I go to different sandwich boards that we put out, I do see that Pinkton, that whole area as a settlement area, according to environmental studies. So I really need clarity about what are we talking about from one meeting to the next.
Right. So for the infrastructure planning, the timeline is much longer than it is for an official planning planning exercise. So when they're looking at an EA, they would be looking at 100 years out, and where might that infrastructure be necessary? Our process is looking more an average of 25 years. So it's not to say that lots, 4, 5, 6, 7 and north wouldn't someday be a settlement area, but they're not being contemplated as a settlement area within this 5-year review.
Okay. One more. This just basically deals with infrastructure as a whole. We've made a lot of investments in South Huron for infrastructure in the Grand Bend area, but even beyond, like in Crediton, London, South London Road, Centralia, huge investments in Exeter, particularly with the Pencil pipeline. And so I'm trying to envision when we start talking about settlement patterns or settlement areas and growth areas, and are we going to be having a discussion here about how that ties into the capacity we have for the infrastructure we've already invested in?
Mhm.
We are going to be having that discussion as a part of this official plan,
Yes,
because I think that's really important.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It might be easier if I proceeded with the next section of the presentation and in that more of that question is answered, but if there's other questions, happy to get into those at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. We have one more question from Councilor Oak.
Yeah, thank you. So those two maps that you had up there, now, I guess my question is, at the back of the report, there's a number of settlement areas that we have where there's vacant land proposed for those settlement areas. I guess, and I'm not saying that these are vacant lands proposed for settlement areas, but should these be separate maps that are in the back like those maps are, as opposed to, in like you're talking about, it shouldn't be really a map in the official plan. It should maybe be an appendix at the back, as proposed. It's not a proposed planning areas, whether those maps should be included like an appendix, that these are areas. Now, I do note you said lot 4, 5, 6, 7, but in the map that you're showing in the other one, lot 4 is being circled in yellow there. And so I guess could we comment on where that one is coming from, being circled as a yellow?
Yeah, I think through the mayor, if I'm understanding your question there correctly, Councillor Oak, I think further to Denise's point, this map causes confusion in that typically when we have those maps at the end of the official plan, there is a clear delineation of where the settlement area boundary is. This Port Blake planning area map is less clear in that you see the red line and you think that must be the Lakeshore settlement area boundary. But back to Denise's point, that is not the case. So for example, on the east side of Highway 21, the Trident property, or formerly Trident, now Soulhaven, that is within the settlement area. Lot 4 is not. And further, there's sort of those scattered pink pieces that would be considered within the Lakeshore settlement area, but the surrounding area is not. And so I think if I'm understanding the gist of your question, what we are suggesting is yes, there needs to be a refinement in the mapping to better indicate where exactly that settlement area boundary is and provide additional clarity to the public as to what those boundaries are and what lands are in fact designated agriculture. And to your point about lot 4, I guess what we're suggesting at this time is that based on the lands needs analysis, if there is, settlement area boundary expansions to be contemplated within the greater Grand Bend area, lot 4, as well as these lands to the east, are the lands that we are suggesting council consider for those potential expansions. So that's why it is certainly circled in yellow at this time.
And just before we get into the growth and development side, you mentioned the Goderich Exeter Railway. I guess just couple things. The elevator that is at the south part of the municipality is no longer going to be operating come summertime, but there is some potential other people that are looking to maybe buy it, so that don't count that railway out yet, that it's not going to potentially be used as a railway again, depending on who buys it. So there's some and then also anytime there's a railway, even if it doesn't get used, there are landowners along that trail or that railway that would be I guess we'd have to really consult with them to see if that is something, because that's a bone of contention for a lot of landowners, whether they want a trail that goes along their property too, that they would have the first right to buy that land as opposed to a trail. So that's been brought up to me a couple times since these discussions have started. So from some of the landowners along there. So just want to make sure that that's on the radar.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Dietrich.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Let's go back to that 100-acre minimum farm size. What are you going to do about a lot of record?
So it would depend on the size of the lot of record and sort of the specifics, but there are policies within the official plan that would already contemplate undersized agricultural parcels and does allow for various things to happen on them. So it's built into the existing policy. I'm not aware of any issues with lots of records that would necessitate a policy change, but happy to review any if you've heard or if you are aware of one.
Well, at one time I had Mike's position there and I was asked if you could put a house on a lot of record. So I did check with the planning department. That's 20 some years ago, but at that time you could. I just wondered if you changed the policy or how that's being handled.
It would depend on the specifics of each situation. In some cases, lots of records would have had a barn built nearby, and thereby that parcel would be therefore sterilized from having a house because of the abutting livestock operations. There could be lots of scenarios with lots of records, so I won't speak sort of generally about them, but just say that there are policies that already contemplate those situations, and we can certainly review that as part of the 5-year review.
Okay, thank you. Moving right along. Great.
Okay, so in this next section, I'm going to speak more about growth and development and what are some of the key questions that staff are contemplating as we move into this sort of next section of the official plan, which is to prepare the first draft of the policy and any associated mapping revisions. So as council will recall at the beginning of this process, I said I really wanted to be able to bring updates to council throughout the process, so that there's no surprises. I'm hoping that we can have a bit of discussion about the vacant lands and where growth is anticipated this evening, so that when you receive that first draft at the July 15th council meeting, there's no surprises in terms of what you're seeing there. So the provincial policies statement directs that municipalities maintain approximately a 25-year growth supply within their urban settlement areas. And so when we look and do the review of the settlement areas within South Huron, there's a few key questions. We want to think about the scale and type of growth that's anticipated within the municipality over the next, as I say, on average 25 to 30 years. Where within the municipality should that future growth be directed? And when we think about growth, we're thinking about everything from residential, employment lands, but also the commercial and mixed use areas that help to support the residents. Recreational, any type of use can be thought about, but we need to be thinking about where do we want to direct future growth? And the final question is, are there available lands and servicing within existing settlement area boundaries to accommodate future growth? And so this is really important in that what's known as a comprehensive review, it contains sort of two components. One is the land needs analysis, and the other is the alignment with the infrastructure planning piece. And so as you've seen noted throughout the document several times, is that we really need to align the land needs assessment with the ongoing water wastewater master plan that's being done by South Huron at this time. It's critical that those two pieces move in alignment. And to Councillor Vaughan's point, very important that we think about and we're fully aware of where South Huron has invested in linear infrastructure and wanting to make sure that all of those investments are able to be fully realized with the land designations. So, much of the background for this, I understand council's already received this report. So we know we're just over 10,000 in terms of the population today and looking to grow by just over 5,000 persons by 2051. That is an annual population growth of 1.4%. And again, in terms of what that translates to in terms of housing units, it's 70 units annually per year for the next 30 years. So we were curious to know, we looked at the work from Watson's and said, they've projected that we're going to increase from building 20 new housing units a year. Again, this isn't where somebody takes a house down and replaces it with another house. This is net new units. Going from 20 to 70 seemed like a fairly substantial increase. And so we were curious to see how does that relate or compare to recent years. And what we saw is that those trends are already being realized in South Huron. In 2022, there was a total of 71 new residential units, and last year, 98 new residential units. So we did want to think about, where do we see the potential for starting with residential growth within South Huron? Certainly we see it in Exeter, in the area surrounding Grand Bend. We do think there's real potential in Huron Park with the current vacant homes there and hoping that they could be utilized for community members. Infilling and rounding out in the existing villages and hamlets. Again, many of those spaces within South Huron do have full municipal services. And so we want to make sure that that's certainly an opportunity that's promoted within the OP. And finally, in agricultural settings, we've already introduced the opportunity for additional residential units. And we also want to be giving special thought to the international agricultural workers within South Huron. You do have several sort of commodity groups, so the greenhouses in particular, as well as the example of Haters, for example, the processing industry that does require additional labor. And how can we help to make sure that the current policies in South Huron leave appropriate doors open for that to occur. And at the same time, we don't want to make the policy so flexible that it could be taken advantage by someone who's actually not accommodating on-farm labor. So it is a bit of a careful policy, and just want to be very clear with council when we're writing that, our goal is again to have reasonable flexibility, but not to be such that we could end up with the decentralization of general housing uses into the prime ag area. So the other thing we have to take into consideration is that when Watson Associates did their work for the county, it was limited to Huron County growth only, and specifically within the borders of South Huron. We would be remiss not to mention the fact that, you know, clearly what's occurring in Lambton Shores over the past number of years does have a direct impact on and pressure on South Huron specifically. And so certainly I've had the opportunity to connect with my planning colleagues in Lambton Shores and was able to receive some data from them in terms of current draft plan approved lots, growth rates, that sort of thing, to try to make sure that we had a really accurate picture of what was happening with our neighbors to the south. It's a little difficult to see, but what's outlined in green on the map on the right-hand side of the screen is the draft plan approved residential and there's some commercial units there too in Lambton Shores. And so what you'll see on the north side of Grand Bend line, they have reached the South Huron border. Those houses have been constructed, and there is certainly a road stub going through saying, you know, this is to access future development lands. On the south side, those lots have been draft plan approved. They are not all entirely built yet by any means. But the fact that they've reached the border, they again have left a cul-de-sac anticipating connection on the South Huron side of that boundary line. And so we did just want to, again, make council aware there's been some very rapid growth in Grand Bend. Between 2016 and 2021, the population increase was 12.9%. For Grand Bend, which is really very significant. Lambton Shores issues the building permits, obviously, in Grand Bend, and so they were able to pull the net new units. So in addition to 171 new single detached dwellings, they also had 91 additions to existing dwellings, 16 new multi-unit dwellings, 2 new mixed commercial and residential, and 9 new commercial buildings within that 4-year span. So really an incredible rate of growth happening there. And so we do need to factor that in. Now, that growth does not factor in for all of South Huron, given the geography. So what's happening in Lambton Shores and in Grand Bend really has no impact on, you know, Elamville, Kirkton Woodham, even Dashwood, to some less extent, you know, Centralia or Crediton. It really is that this growth needs to be contemplated exclusively for the area surrounding Grand Bend. So just wanted to be clear, we're not factoring this growth for all settlement areas. It's just the settlement area immediately surrounding. So now we're going to start talking about some of the areas that are vacant. And this is where there's a level of subjectivity, I think, in how we look at these. And so I did want to certainly walk through with council. What we start with is, first of all, where is the settlement area boundary and which lands are vacant? From there, we obviously know a little bit more about some of these parcels. So which of these vacant parcels are within a floodplain? Which of these vacant parcels have had recent planning approvals, let's say for a plan of subdivision? And so all of that gets factored into the report that I provided showed the net number of hectares that were vacant and then the ones which we considered to be constrained. So for Port Blake, I think what's really important is just, again, to show you that the heavy black line, that is the lands that are within the settlement area. You can see it's a bit of an odd shape. There's actually an area west of 21 that's designated agriculture, which is why it juts over in the way that it does. So there might be some opportunity to sort of streamline that. If we start at the north end, though, just in terms of vacant lands, I think I would call the two at the corner of Gore Road, Highway 83 and Highway 21 to perhaps not be vacant, but maybe underutilized. There's maybe more potential for intensification. What we do know about those lands, though, is that the intersection has been raised as a concern. And I think there's some contemplation of eventual upgrades to that intersection. But at this time, that is a factor that we do have to consider. Moving south, there's a 2.2 acre property that, again, would be considered underutilized. But many of the lands on the that would be considered vacant, the 0.7, that's within a floodplain. What we know is that the 30.1 acres north of the watercourse on the east side is obviously the Soul Haven plan of subdivision. And so that's had planning approvals given. And so we had to sort of take out the net number of what did we actually think was vacant there. And I'm just going to refer to the, let's go through this one by one. So again, total 51 hectares. And of those with development constraints, we said it was 8.5 hectares, leading us to have 43 hectares that would be designated, that would be vacant and potentially able to take on additional development. I do apologize, council. The maps do show it in acres, and then I did my analysis in both hectares and acres. Some people have a preference for acres, so that is why the maps were done in acres. Let's go on to Dashwood. So I'm going to talk about these at a fairly high level. The situation in Dashwood is that while we do have some parcels designated for development, they're all very small and most of them have some level of development constraint. So we have some that are immediately abutting a municipal drain, several that would require a significant road extension, water extension. We have others that are quite frankly a bit undersized in terms of justifying. If I use Milton Street for an example, I don't have a I don't know if I can do a laser with this one. Let me try that. Okay. Milton Street, for those of you less familiar with Dashwood, it is in the southwest quadrant. And so you'll see those two parcels there that are vacant, the 1.2 and 0.6 acres. The fact is that while those lands are vacant, the extension of Milton Street would be quite expensive if you're only going to realize a very limited number of lots. And so I think my general feeling with Dashwood is that while there is some land available, it's such that it's not conducive to any sort of large scale development. And we may need to look at a modest expansion or sort of a rejigging of these lands in order to really have future potential for development in Dashwood. Moving on to Shipka, there are some lands that are designated in Shipka and relatively unconstrained. So there are opportunities there, about 11 acres. So for Crediton, Crediton's a very interesting one. So when we look overall, there are a substantial amount of lands designated and vacant within the Crediton settlement area. So 214 acres are currently designated within the settlement area boundary. Again, I've deducted about 13 acres as being constrained. We have a floodplain at the far east end of Crediton, which would not allow those lands to be developed for residential or really any purpose. But what that leaves us with is a net 200 acres of unconstrained development land. And so I did want to point this one out to council. When we think about, should Crediton have grown by 1 acre per year, with 200 acres of unconstrained development, that would mean that we have 200 years of growth within Crediton. And I can tell you that we certainly have not in Crediton been growing by 1 acre per year. So we potentially have more than 200-year land supply in Crediton. Based on provincial guidance, we should be having an average of 25 years of land designated for growth. So I would like to think about some options to sort of right size Crediton and think about, yes, we have certainly invested in full services here. We want to make sure that we're aligning the designated boundary line with that infrastructure investment. But planning staff would contemplate a fairly substantial reduction to the size of the settlement area in Crediton, and that we would reallocate those lands to a settlement area that would be anticipated to have more growth based on recent trends. So Exeter, for example. Okay. Can come back to that if council has any further questions. I would, or I'm happy to take questions now. Why don't we do it now?
Questions, Councillor Oak?
Yeah, I guess the first question I would have is, well, I think we've been building a number of houses in Crediton the last year, and there's another wave being built. So I think that 1 acre per year is being exceeded or will be exceeded in the next few years here. But my big concern or question is, why would we get rid of this if it's already designed, the settlement area is already set? Why would we reduce that? Like what is it? Why would it be in our best interest to reduce that settlement area and then have to go through increasing it down the road someday if something changes? If it's already there, why not just leave it there? I guess is the question, and expand in other areas if that's growth areas as well, sort of thing. So instead of robbing Peter to pay Paul sort of scenario.
So again, with a comprehensive review, what we have to look at is that, is there sufficient lands to accommodate growth? And so if you go to the page 11, what it says is that the land needed to accommodate growth outside of South Huron. So I've projected the growth based on how many units are projected to be within Exeter and how many are projected to be outside Exeter as the primary settlement area over the next 30 years, roughly 25 years. So it's 681 units are anticipated to be directed outside of Exeter. Using a units per hectare, right? So you can sort of see how I've arrived at those numbers. So it would suggest that we need 168 acres of land designated to accommodate that growth, and we currently have over 400 designated. So what that would suggest is that we don't need to do any settlement area adjustments because you have enough land designated. In fact, you have over double of what's projected to be needed. So it becomes difficult to justify any expansions to any other settlement areas when we already have that many acres. Just think of it as net acres in the municipality as a whole. So the question is, do we have enough? Yes. We don't want to reduce that number. I can understand council's perspective on that. You don't want to go any lower, but are those acres in the right place?
And I don't disagree with you on that, but the landowner that already has this land in this settlement area is going to have a different opinion, knowing that someday it's going to be worth a lot more to them. It's already in a settlement area, been approved in a settlement area. And then we all of a sudden cut that in half. They're going to have definitely a differing opinion on that stance, I guess. And yeah, I hear you, you know, because I know we need some more area in surrounding Exeter based on the potential growth of number of units, 1,200 units in the next 30 years versus the 600 outside of Exeter being proposed. And so there's going to be more area needed around the settlement area of Exeter. But I just don't see taking it away. That's just my thought, that if the growth is there, we just expand the growth in the settlement area and get approval to, because they want to build houses. So you build houses where you can build houses the easiest potentially, or where the people are going to live or work.
Go ahead, Denise.
I would also say that the lands in Crediton have not been set up particularly well for future development in many cases. We have corners of Crediton that are designated for which there have been no road allowances extended. They are fragmented ownership. We're dealing with, we might have 3 different property owners that own the frontage, but they don't own any of the lands in behind. Therefore, the likelihood of those lands being developed again goes down. It's far more difficult. If we look at King Street North, again, limited access back in behind to those parcels. We have undersized streets, so Middle Street and the one that goes north-south, both of which are considerably undersized for any future access back to that parcel to the north. So there are some challenges with some of the parcels that are developed or designated in Crediton. But understand the point. You would, if it would be possible to justify an expansion, and I'll say potentially to Exeter, without needing to de-designate Crediton, that would be the direction of council. So.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Councilor.
Yeah, and that's fair. I'm just asking the question, with all those limitations of the property, I wonder how the settlement area was established to begin with then. You know, in the past, because this has been here for a number of years, and I guess I'm just wondering how that was established at the time.
I should pull up a photo of 1879. Crediton looks almost identical as to how it looked in that historical survey. In fairness to the people who drew out those surveys, at that time, Exeter did not exist. Grand Bend was really not contemplated. And at that time, they anticipated that Crediton was going, you know, centrally located within this part of the geography, was going to be the primary settlement area. Right? 150 years later, we have different factors to consider. Fully appreciate a de-designating of land is a careful exercise. We would certainly need to be doing consultation with all of the landowners who would potentially be affected by that type of a decision. So appreciate council's input on that.
Counselor Need.
I think too, going along with that, like the de-designation of some of these areas would allow us to promote development closer to serviced areas too. So I think that's something we need to take into account when we're looking at some of these areas is where does it make the most sense to have development considering our current services?
Go ahead, Denise.
Okay, so looking into Huron Park, the Huron Park, technically based on vacant lands, it looks like there's quite a bit of land, but what we know is that the majority of those lands are required for the runways and therefore are not able to have further development. Did have an excellent conversation with one of the landowners on the industrial side of Huron Park who has purchased a number of properties over the years, just did a recent development and feels there's a lot of potential in Huron Park for future industrial development. Some of the limitations from an employment standpoint side of things is that the lands that are designated on the west side of Airport Line, there's a very broad designation currently. It contemplates anything from commercial to industrial to community facility. While there are some lands that are vacant, the majority of them are not being made available to the market at this time. And so in fact, there are very limited opportunities. Some of the smaller vacant parcels are actually the ones owned by the municipality. So I think the 1.3 acres owned by the municipality, the 0.4 to the north, sort of by the water tower. There's now the fire hall property. So there is a few there that are owned by the municipality, but otherwise there's not a lot of opportunity in Huron Park for land acquisition, I guess I would say at this time. On the east side, certainly, yes, we do know through the approved plan of subdivision that the former school lands and some of the former park spaces have been left as larger blocks. So that would certainly accommodate future development. North of Algonquin Drive, there is certainly potential there, but don't want to keep or don't want to lose track of the fact that we do have a municipal drain cutting through that area. It does flood to some extent seasonally. And so there would need to be some infrastructure changes if they were looking to develop that portion. Okay, looking into Centralia, so we do have, quite a considerable number of lands that are vacant. I did sort of discount those ones that were immediately abutting the railway, recognizing they're quite small and several don't have road access. So I did count some to be constrained, as well as the 8.8 acre property that's on the east side or the right-hand side of the screen at the north there. That one is nearly entirely within a floodplain. So some constrained lands in Centralia, but overall, there's still certainly opportunity for future residential or other types of development within Crediton. How we do it within our urban settlement areas outside of Exeter and Grand Bend is that we simply designate the entire settlement area urban, and that leads for more flexibility to designate actual land use based on zoning. Okay, so we're here in Greenway. Opportunities here for future development, modest, but still there for infilling. Similar to Corbett, not a lot of opportunity in Corbett within the existing settlement area. 1 acre identified. Here we are in Mount Carmel, still a very sizable parcel that would be potential, and it does have frontage on 2 roads. So that's the kind of parcel, if we think about Dashwood, for example, that's what Dashwood doesn't have. It doesn't have one large contiguous parcel where a developer could go in and achieve the economies of scale required in order to make development economically feasible. So we do have a nice sized parcel here in Mount Carmel. It would stay where it is, but we would look at doing maybe something similar for Dashwood. Elamville, again, very limited opportunities here. This is one of the settlement areas that does not have public sewer, and I don't believe it has public water either at this time. Okay. And Kirkton. So again, a little misleading in Kirkton. South of Kirkton Road, the majority of those lands are within a natural hazard. So there is a water course running through there, and it does again flood seasonally. So not a lot of actual development potential there, which is why a number of the acres were identified as being constrained, but a very sizable parcel to the north, over 25 acres. And here we are in Woodham, and still again, decent opportunities for some infilling and rounding out should someone be interested in doing so. Before we get into Exeter, I thought I might just pause for another minute. So we're not contemplating any changes to the settlement area boundaries outside of the 2 that I noted, being So Dashwood, potentially a modest increase or maybe a rejigging of some of those lands such that we could have one larger parcel. I would say that we have one very prominent landowner in Dashwood who I have a conversation booked with. So I'll be having that conversation will inform some of the potential shifts in Dashwood. We are, as I say, contemplating whether or not a reduction to Crediton would be advisable at this time. Noted that for council, and we are certainly looking at opportunities to look at the Lambton Shores growth in terms of thinking about Greater Grand Bend. So all the other settlement areas are proposed to stay as is. Yes.
Go ahead, Councillor Bond.
Thank you. Yeah, so Huron Park, couple of slides back, there was vacant land around the airport, particularly sort of around the runways, 60.5 acres on the northwest, I think, and then 143.7 on the southeast. And so in terms of those specific big parcels of land, they're not zoned residential or no. And they wouldn't be appropriate, I don't think, for residential. So are they even appropriate for industrial? Like expansion of employment lands? I'm just looking at those vacant lands and thinking we're going through some rejigging. What do we see as really a future for those particular parcels?
So in order to maintain the viability of the runways for the airport use, there has to be certain setbacks and clearances from the actual runways and then from the taxi areas. So the taxi area would be the area that's sort of abutting where the existing development has been historically. So where the hangars were, the areas that are used by the current airport use. And so that the taxi areas, again, that's the area where the aircraft are obviously moving slower. Those areas can have development abutting and adjacent. For the areas that are actually the runways and moving towards the runways, those are spaces require greater setback distances. So certainly be happy to have a conversation with the landowner to see if there is any potential for, maybe a little bit of rounding out, maybe along airport line, for example. But my sense is that they need this space for the buffer to the railway, or sorry, to the airport.
Yeah, so just in thinking of the province says you're allowed so many acres of planning over so many years and so on and so forth. Does it make sense to have these two rather large parcels incorporated into that equation? I mean, if after having a discussion with the owner, you are able to determine there really isn't an opportunity to build either employment lands, and definitely I wouldn't want to live that close to the airport. Should we be removing those? Is there a different way to zone these so that these aren't incorporated into our settlement land equation?
Yes, so they're not currently included. So if you look at table 2, that's a residential land summary. And for Huron Park, we've used 15.9 hectares, which is 39.4 acres. The 39.4 acres was achieved with the 30.4 size parcel on the east side, the 6.3 and the 2.7. So it did not include those.
Okay, I made the sweeping assumption that all vacant lands in pink on these maps were in the settlement areas, but that's not correct.
Thank you.
We only, yeah.
Councillor Oak.
Yeah, that was just, I wanted to clarify that this vacant analysis isn't just necessary residential. It's vacant land that is available for residential, industrial, commercial potential.
That's correct.
Okay. And then thank you, Mayor, follow up. On the one slide you had in Grand Bend for the growth, it said 64% of the private dwellings were occupied by usual residents. What do you mean by usual residents? And how does that compare to say South Huron, when it comes to usual residents?
Yes. So when people are filling out their census forms, they have to note if they own multiple dwellings, they have to note which one is their primary dwelling. And so that becomes the usual residence. And then the secondary dwelling would be the other. What we have seen anecdotally, I think is also supported, is that we've had a number of persons as a result of retirees of the baby boomer generation, but also I would say accelerated by COVID was what happened was people were selling their other main dwelling, let's say in the GTA area, and making their either Lambton Shores or South Huron dwelling their primary. We won't actually see that entirely captured until the next census in 2026, but we're sort of forecasting out that we anticipate we're going to see that continual to go higher as the baby boomer population chooses to make their maybe formerly seasonal cottage property their primary residence in Ontario, or in Canada, I should say.
Councillor Rowe?
So the line said as of 2021. So does that, so that doesn't mean after 2021. That's a snapshot as of 2021, what the 64% was.
Yeah, it's tied to the census. We don't otherwise have a really great way of tracking that. Okay, let's move into Exeter because that is one of the areas where we actually have different designations of the land based on employment area. So industrial, commercial, residential. As I said, we don't make that distinction within the majority of the settlement areas in South Huron, but we do in Exeter. And again, we do in the area north of Grand Bend. So when we look at the areas in Exeter, let's start with the employment lands. So what we know is that in 2015, the county did an employment land strategy that looked across the county, and they did an analysis that included the area in Exeter. When I analyzed the way in which that study was done, virtually the identical parcels that are vacant today were accounted for in 2015, save and except for the lands which JMR has built on at the east end of Thames Road. And so what we know is that we do have a substantial number of lands that are designated industrial. We have some large undeveloped parcels. The difficulty with industrial is that we don't have developers doing plans of subdivision for industrial purposes in the same way that we do for residential. We have had a industrial plan of subdivision approved at the north end of Exeter for many years, was originally known as Land Rush and then now has become CVD. But unfortunately for various reasons that has not been registered. The difficulty again, when we're trying to respond, as Selena said, to inquiries, someone who maybe wants to start up a new business, they have an existing business and they're looking to get into a bigger space. On average, those calls are between typically 1 to 3 acres, sometimes up to 5 acres if they're looking for a bit of room for expansion. It's incredibly expensive to think that a smaller outfit is going to take on a 40-acre parcel and develop the plan of subdivision, do all the technical studies, build the roads, extend the water and the servicing, do the stormwater management, when in fact, all they're really looking for is maybe 2 acres that they can put up a building on. And so the difficulty with our employment lands in Exeter is not that we don't necessarily have enough of them, but that they're not subdivided into parcels that align with the investment interest. So I think that's certainly something for council to consider. It's possible we may look at a modest expansion to employment lands within Exeter, but we would want to really think about, is that in fact going to help us meet our goals in terms of industrial development? Or is it going to bring on another sort of large undeveloped parcel that may not in fact be utilized in the 25-year? So that's something we want to look at. Certainly also want to look at how the water wastewater master plan conceives of future development, particularly at the north end of Exeter, and where we can align with the recommendations of that study. Okay. Moving to residential, we do have some lands that are designated for residential, which are vacant. Now, many of the small pieces are sort of scattered here and there. Those were not included as part of being sort of significant in terms of the analysis. We're really looking for parcels that can yield a higher number of units. certainly want to consider, there is still the opportunity for an intensification factor. So when we think about the idea that, well, we currently have streets, for example, that would have singles, there would be the opportunity for additional residential units, even a triplex, that sort of thing. But all of that is very incremental and it will be cumulative over time, but it's unlikely to yield a really high number of units based on our existing servicing that we have throughout Exeter. So we are really limiting our analysis to those large undeveloped sites. Starting at the north, we have a 21.9 acre piece to the south of where Northlander is located at the sort of the southern terminus of Rosemount Avenue. So that's certainly a possible parcel for development. Always needing to think about that we do need to think about some level of buffer between the industrial use to the north and that residential parcel. The next being what was Manx and now I understand is being referred to as Windermere. Trying to keep track. They like to change their names. So the 58.3 acre parcel has an approved plan of subdivision on it, and we do anticipate that will be developing out. Once we get into the south end, and certainly moving up the west side, this is where the infrastructure questions become really critical. What we understand is that there currently are some limitations to development in the south and on the west side of Exeter, owing to the fact that there are some major infrastructure upgrades needed, particularly to the sanitary. This is where the alignment of the official plan designation and the infrastructure need to move together, right? To have all the lands designated in a space that would be most financially expensive to do the infrastructure upgrades is not a good outcome for the community. Development is unlikely to happen, and thereby we're going to further go into a housing deficit. So what we need to look at is there potentially a need? So the east side of Exeter, there is some certainly contemplation within the existing wastewater master plan. I'm sure council has seen the draft. It certainly contemplates an expansion on the east side, recognizing there would need to be work done looking at the pressure zones from a water perspective, but that it's conceivable to think that there would be development occur on the east side and that it might work its way clockwise around in terms of infrastructure investments. That is what needs further analysis and further alignment with the work that's currently being undertaken by GM Blue Plan. So I say right now, it is the lands to the east, north of Huron Road that were contemplated for expansion. And I will say that is also what we heard at the local community table. We did have some of the affected landowners present, and they certainly indicated that that was something that they would be supportive of and wanting to build additional units for the community. Any questions on Exeter? Yes.
Councillor Oak.
Yeah, so want to go back to the industrial commercial land. Now there's a requirement. What is the requirement on what percentage of land we have to have available at any one time for commercial industrial? Because this is the Exeter settlement area, but we also have the Hero Park settlement area where there might be some opportunities to have some land there as well. Potential, I guess. Are we we're not in a good position right at the moment, in my mind, in industrial commercial land availability for the municipality. If, like you said, the smaller blocks or even the bigger blocks, because they're not necessarily motivated at this time.
So there's absolutely other properties that do allow for industrial development. So there's sort of four major areas in South Huron, being Exeter, Huron Park, Grand Bend. At the Motorplex, there are lands there that are designated industrial. And then there are the lands, what would be the former Dashwood Industries property, which is also designated for industrial purposes. It might be able to be intensified based on what's currently happening at that property. I understand it is occupied, but there may be future potential there or additional potential there. I think again, we are looking to have the similar 30-year essentially in terms of projected growth. I think what's difficult in any comprehensive review exercise is in a rural context, we have very geographically dispersed growth. We tend to have slower growth and it tends to be more intermittent. So if I use the City of London, for example, and they're looking at their employment lands, well, they have a higher rate of growth. They're able to project out what they need, and they can define, here's the areas that are going to develop within the next 30 years. And that in fact occurs, right? What we have in South Huron's context is a much slower growth environment in which, and we are much more geographically dispersed. So what we've argued from a rural planning perspective, and it's actually why in the 2024 PPS, the words comprehensive review are actually been removed. And what they're looking at is that you do a growth analysis. It still has to be very justified, the amount of land that you have designated. But what they've recognized is that the comprehensive review exercise as currently defined within the PPS is very challenging to apply in a rural context. So whether that applies for residential or employment lands, that's certainly where this idea, Councillor Oak, about, well, you already have potentially well in exceedance of the amount of land required. Do we need to move to a de-designation in order to bring on other lands online? I think a strict interpretation of a comprehensive review would say, yes, we do. I think we can certainly try to craft the argument that because of our rural context, we would prefer not to do that. But I think it does make it far more difficult for staff to defend when we have this excess of lands designated. What I also want to be really clear about with Exeter, you're right. So this idea of employment lands, we could bring on additional employment lands, but is that going to bring them on in the size and scale and range that would really align with making them available to the market? The South Huron Chamber did note this, as well as again, someone I had already spoken to in Huron Park, that they do receive calls and they are within that sort of 1 to 3 acres is what they're looking for. Some municipalities have taken it upon themselves. They have municipally owned industrial parks where they have purchased the lands, they have done the development, right? They built the roads, they built the sewers, and then they sell those lands. And that is a cost recovery process to help to advance economic development activities, but done at the municipality's initiative.
Councillor Oak?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you. So that map, say for example, the southwest part of Exeter, it's going to cost a fair bit of money to upgrade the infrastructure. If you were to take that land and move it over to the east side so that we're not creating any additional land, but it would be easier potentially to develop because the infrastructure is there, or potentially more likely to be there at a lot less cost. Is that something that instead of expanding the settlement area, you're just moving some of that? If it's going to cost too much to put that land into use, is that something that would be potential?
At this time, I wouldn't recommend any de-designation from the existing Exeter boundary. It's a very logical boundary. There is still the opportunity for those lands to be developed, provided it may take an economies of scale. So it may take multiple landowners at the south side working at the same coordinated time in order to finance the work that needs to be done there. Grants, there can be other things that come up that no one has a crystal ball. I'm not interested in de-designating anything in Exeter, quite frankly, based on projected growth. The idea of expanding Exeter, again, part of that was thinking about projected growth, the amount of lands which are considered unconstrained within a 25-year timeframe. It's possible that if we were to take, let's say, for example, 75 to 100 acres out of the Crediton settlement area, we would simply move those to Exeter. Again, the other thing is we think about protection of prime farmland. So I know that's certainly come up at a lot of the tables. I know OFA regularly shares the number that Ontario loses 319 acres of farmland per day. The idea is that if we expand a settlement area boundary by another 100 acres, that is a net loss to agriculture. If we were to return a portion of the Crediton subdivision or settlement area to agriculture, we would have a net zero effect on the overall agricultural land base in South Huron. Now, some people could make the argument, the land in Crediton may not develop in the next 30 years anyhow, right? So it's about, is it more of a theoretical exercise than an actual practical? At the end of the day, Where we have development around Exeter, almost any of the parcels, whether they're inside the settlement area boundary or not, they are prime agriculture. So we always want to make sure that we are making the most efficient use of that land. And that's where the intensification policies really need to be strong.
Councillor Oak?
Yeah, I agree. Although it makes more sense to put it beside a settlement area than to plop 100 acres out in the middle of nowhere and put a housing residential unit or development up. You know, this is where the services are. This is where the natural extension means. There's more than 319 acres a day being lost to construction on these farms as well. So, you know, so people have some place to live. We have to find that for them as well. Right?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Lise.
Okay, so we've touched on a lot of this, but again, the housing forecast for South Huron, again, those 1,900 and change units that are needed over the next 30 years, the idea that 58% are projected to be within Exeter and the remaining 681 outside. Now, we've used a very conservative minimum density. It was recommended by Watson Associates at 15 units per hectare within Exeter and 10 units per hectare in all other settlement areas. Certainly our settlement areas that do not have full services, they would not be able to achieve 10 units per hectare. So if we think of places like Kirkton Woodham and Elamville that are working on private sanitary services, that would not be realistic, but on average, this is what we're looking for. And so again, what we're looking at within Exeter is that we have a need for 82 hectares and currently unconstrained, based on the early findings of the Water Wastewater Master Plan, we have approximately 66.5. So we would have a need to expand. And again, I've put that in there pending servicing investments. So part of the question is from the water wastewater, what of those infrastructure investments are conceived of occurring within the next 25 years? And that's the piece that we need further alignment on. And then again, we've talked about outside Exeter, we do have an excess of lands. So again, we've talked about some of these things at a high level. What the employment land strategy identified was some of the things that we want to contemplate when we're looking at changing the policies for employment lands. We are looking to create a little bit, what's really important is we want to make sure we have a high level of protection on our employment lands. There's a very high test in the PPS if anyone's looking to remove lands from an industrial designation and move to residential, because the idea is that we need places for people to work and we need to protect those spaces. Council would have heard Selena and my other planning colleagues talk about land use compatibility studies, noise, dust, vibration. The fact of the matter is that places that have jobs often create some of those potential nuisance impacts. And so they need to be kept further away from encroaching residential such that they can continue to do the good things they do and employ the people who work there. So we want to be thinking about creating a bit more flexibility within our employment lands, but still protecting that overall land base. Some of the target areas we're certainly thinking about in terms of sectors for South Huron, looking at advanced manufacturing, agribusiness and food processing, transportation, warehousing and wholesale, thinking about those business services, where could we potentially allow for some of them? We do have some within the Thames Road corridor today, and then employment supportive uses. So again, we've talked about a lot of this. Again, the idea is that a lot of the large undeveloped parcels just aren't shovel ready, which is limiting opportunity for investment attraction. Our goal is to provide a range of employment areas so that site selection has a variety of parcel configuration, a zoning, location, and that when someone calls and says, you know, I'm looking for this type of site, we would potentially have some options. So these are some of the recommendations that were South Huron specific from the 2015 employment strategy. It was looking at ways in which we could be a bit more permissive. So permitting research and development laboratories. We do permit business park type uses, which they thought was a good thing. I've even seen it where some like private recreation, for example, if someone wanted to open a gym, would that be conducive within our industrial areas? We have certainly seen that be successful in many other settlement areas. So this is where the alignment between what the employment strategy study has said informs the official plan policies, and that will then inform the permitted uses within the M1 and M2 zones within South Huron. This is really important why, you know, stopping at the official plan level doesn't entirely work. Where we want to see change on the ground, we need to get those changes all the way through into the zoning bylaw so that they become applicable law for building permits. And again, no significant change over the past 10-year period in terms of Exeter's employment areas. We have seen major change in Huron Park. So we've had several new and expanding industries since 2010, including Blue Water Pipe, Waste Management, Nudie, and most recently the Trailer Factory. There are some vacant lands, but again, the former Centralia College property is not currently being made available to the market. And we do understand from speaking with one of the owners that there are some sort of historic conditions associated with that property, which do make its development more complicated. So again, we have some early ideas. We'd like to provide some stronger direction regarding employment supportive uses in the employment areas. So this would be one to take a look at when we bring back the policies. There will be some shifts contemplated in the employment area policy section. So overall, based on the land needs assessment, these are the five early recommendations. So again, that the area surrounding Grand Bend, the east side, as well as a portion of the Pork Lake planning area, that being lot 4 immediately to the north of the existing settlement area boundary, be assessed for settlement area expansion. This would be for both residential and mixed use, so commercial community facility, but not for employment areas. Again, this area would be reclassified on the maps as the Greater Grand Bend settlement area, and we do conceive of writing special policy area direction in lieu of a secondary plan. That is what is proposed to come back as the first draft for consideration from the community. If the community and council is not satisfied, you can continue with the direction of saying that you would like a secondary plan, but we as staff would like the opportunity to craft a special policy area and see if we can't meet the concerns of that community within the policy direction.
Councillor Vaughn?
Realize you haven't drafted it yet, but I'm just wondering what kinds of things are in that particular document.
So it's still within the official plan. It's not a separate document. It would just be that we would have more specific policy directions for that settlement area than we would have for any of the other settlement areas outside Exeter. So when you read the South Huron official plan today, there is again, the urban section is the one that we had talked to council about at the section 26 meeting. It is the most lengthy and perhaps difficult to follow section, I think I'll say. And so we would like to rewrite the urban section entirely. For the vast majority of settlement areas across South Huron, they would follow similar policy direction based on how they're serviced and their classification, whether it's sort of that primary, secondary, or tertiary. When we look at both so what would be currently called the Pork Lake planning area and what we're conceiving to be called of the Greater Grand Bend area, as well as Exeter, they have more specific policies because that's where more growth is being directed, and therefore we need more detailed policies. So it would be getting down right into what do we anticipate in terms of future community facility, commercial uses, clarifying when residential development happens, what are the types of things that would need to be contained within a residential plan of subdivision in order for it to be supported. So things like we talked about an integrated community trail was certainly something that came up at multiple tables at the Lakeshore meeting. Access to natural spaces, again, recognizing, so I think there's many things sort of recognizing the geography of that area and how can we tie into Lambton Shores in terms of walkability. So we do have as one of our recommendations that we would be reaching out and having consultation with Lambton Shores staff so that the special policy area contemplates cross-border considerations.
Okay. Further?
I'm sure I'm going to have further ones. One of the issues that I do recall coming up at the the meeting out there for the Lakeshore was around Highway 21 and traffic. And I did see traffic mentioned as a concern. As people were in their respective tables, they were asking questions about traffic and how it was going to be managed and what their concerns were and how in the summer it's really quite difficult to get from A to B. Some members were reminded of, how Grand Cove was built in terms of there's 400 80 structures back there and there's only one exit.
Mhm.
And so what does that look like for future subdivisions and things like that? And so I had heard after the meeting from a couple of constituents that they were not too happy with the responses they were getting, because basically they were being told when traffic and Highway 21 was being brought up that it really wasn't something that this municipality could do anything about. It was under MTO jurisdiction, and so therefore it wasn't even being discussed. Didn't sit well with those particular constituents that I guess their minds are thinking, okay, why are we expanding in an area that we don't control? So just to be very blunt, if we cannot talk about ingress and egress on a particular roadway that we're planning on building substantial subdivisions, then what are we doing? Yeah, so I don't know. That's a good question. What are we doing? And what are the plans for? I know if you have a what do they call that? A link like Grand Bend, most of the town of Grand Bend, that is a link that they look after those roadways, whereas the South Huron portion on Highway 21 is not a connecting link. It's definitely the province calls the shots and suggestions we may have about trails or the roadway or walkability and so forth. It's, well, that's all up to MTO, and that's not flying as a very good response. So how are we going to deal with that?
Before we go any further, thanks for the question. I have to go. I have another appointment I have to get to. I'm just wondering if council would mind if Councillor Neve would take the chair, because since the deputy's not here, I know Councillor Neve has chaired the Committee of Adjustment. So if that's appropriate for council, is there a procedure for that? Okay. Yeah, I know we'll need a vote for that.
Yes, if they could have a motion to have someone take, or Councillor need to take the chair.
Could somebody make a motion for someone to chair then, please? Councillor Oak, seconded by Councillor Neeb. Any discussion? Call the question, all in favor? That carries with 6. Thank you very much. And I have to go, so I'll turn it over to Mr. Neeb. You're in good hands.
All right, are there any further questions or comments from council? Yeah, Mercy Cole.
I just asked a huge question and I haven't got an answer.
Through the chair, we have requested a consultation with MTO as part of the 5-year review. They would be one of the key agencies in which we would like to consult with. To date, we've not received a response on that request. It was made some time ago. The example I would give, though, in terms of how an official plan policy or planning exercise could align with MTO would be a recent experience, the Bayfield Secondary Plan. What we were able to achieve with that planning exercise was we were able to get both vehicular and pedestrian counts done at an intersection of concern, actually at 2 intersections of concern, and then there was support from MTO for a new pedestrian crosswalk. And so that is in sort of the technical assessment. In terms of the intersection in that case that was looked at, they did indicate that yes, based on current turning movements, there would need to be upgrades. However, we are in a queue with the rest of the province and we would be nowhere near the top of the queue. So at least it provided us with some baseline data as to, okay, they know that there's an issue here. We're in a queue in terms of when in which, what time at which that would actually be upgraded. So we would seek to have a very similar conversation with with MTO in regards to the area north of Grand Bend. Certainly, there was lots of discussion at those tables about how much everyone likes the separated trail, the bike trail that they have south of Grand Bend. Is there the opportunity for something like that, even on one side of the road, to be extended north? We talked about the access to the Port Blake Day Park and how currently you can't get there unless you have a vehicle. So there are definitely things that we would want to talk very specifically about with MTO. And again, we've made that request as staff, and we will follow up and try to get a meeting. Ideally not with their, not just with the corridor staff, with the broader engineering staff. That's been my experience, is that you need sort of multiple sub-departments of MTO present in order to be able to talk about the full range of issues with that section of corridor.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so okay, that trail is definitely something that comes up from time to time. Speed limit is something that also comes up from time to time. So when you're talking to them about that, a lot of people feel they're taking their life in their hand on that friggin' corridor. And sidewalks, if there are going to be any, or if that falls in the purview of MTO because it's within their, I don't know, distance from the middle of the road on Highway 21, like if those are going to be allowed. Yeah, if all of those things, and also entryways, egress, ingress, these huge subdivisions that we're looking at growing, like Tridon Phase 1, that's 180-ish residential units now. Phase 2 is about the same. And it's not even a clear story so far, not been given to council in terms of permitted. Are those entryways for each of those subdivisions going to be permitted? Is it only one? Is it two? Those are the kinds of things with MTO. I certainly would like to hear some kind of discussion going on. Because if they have that much say over that many elements, it really makes me think, why would we even consider for a moment expanding that settlement area? From a just traffic and walkability perspective, that's a concern. Okay.
While we're on Grand Bend, I just thought the one final thing I would say in terms of moving north is that we certainly did speak with the community about the fact that the current turbines in that particular area would have limit for any future residential development. So again, we're looking 25 years out. It is possible that those contracts do not extend beyond the planning horizon. And so we do want to still consider this area, but for the short term, there's absolutely a limitation on any residential development within the 550 of those existing turbines.
Councillor Oak?
Yeah, I would suggest that probably that lot 4 would be affected right away, because I know that there was some concern on the Solhaven property of how close the one was to that property, and had to adjust some of the lots accordingly. So I would assume that the next one up will be that much closer, and the back half of that property might be affected for sure. So
okay, so we'll just go through the rest of the early recommendations. So again, we've addressed Grand Bend. Again, staff will draft a special area policy in lieu of a secondary plan for council's consideration, for the community's consideration. It doesn't mean that we can't make further changes, but it's for consideration within the first draft. We do have that the Crediton settlement area be substantially reduced in size, and that those lands be allocated to settlement areas that have full services and significant projected growth. We've received direction from council tonight that if possible to avoid that. I would like to make clear to council that we would like to be able to have some level of discussion with the landowners in Crediton to understand their perspective. So just want council to be aware that those conversations would be undertaken should you receive a call from anyone saying that we've reached out to have a conversation about that. Okay, that modest adjustments to the other settlement areas, specifically Dashwood, be informed through further public consultation, including landowners of large undeveloped parcels. that the Exeter settlement area be assessed for possible expansion of residential, mixed use and employment lands to align infrastructure to align with the infrastructure as outlined within the municipal water wastewater master plan. So again, as indicated, it is the lands to the east that are currently being contemplated by that water wastewater master plan. So that is the area that we would be assessing to see whether or not it was justified to be brought into the settlement area. I do want to be clear, this is a very technical exercise. There will be a very strong correlation between those infrastructure investment pieces. Because bringing land into the settlement area is a substantial decision in terms of the potential increase in market value that those lands have. There are others who have indicated an interest in having their lands brought into the Exeter settlement area. And so I just want to be very clear, right, that there's a high motivation for people to see their lands be brought into the settlement area. We will not be able to be supportive of all of the lands, and thereby it has to be highly technical in that it is clearly related to the water wastewater master plan recommendations. It's going to be effectively related to infrastructure. Okay. And finally, that the South Huron industrial areas outside of Exeter be assessed for area expansion for employment lands to align with the water wastewater master plan. So for example, in Huron Park, there are some current limitations within the lift station, I believe is what it's called. And if Don were here, he would correct me. I believe it's the lift station. And so that may have some limitation on our ability to expand for employment uses in Huron Park, but we certainly want to take a close look at that. And if there is an opportunity, we would be bringing that to council's attention. Okay, so mapping modernization, I will go through these very quickly. Again, just want to give council a bit of a sense of what you're going to see in July. The mapping work is well underway. And again, we're looking to make these sort of AODA accessible, clean, easy to read maps. This is the updated, the South Huron official plan map and the Schedule B. We are looking to make adjustments between the agricultural and natural environment designations such that we are making corrections. I did want to show council there are some fairly substantial size corrections, but I wanted to be really clear about what we are doing and what we aren't doing, because sometimes this can be a level of confusion. And so I just want to be really clear that within the natural environment mapping approach is that we're designating the natural features that exist on the landscape. But there are some qualifiers to that. We do not designate small areas such as hedgerows, areas along drains, very small sort of shadow effects that occur with the aerial imagery. Some years they'll fly one way and there'll be a shadow to the east. The next year they fly the other way and there's a shadow to the west. We will not be capturing that level of detail. When we pass the maps, again, council, remember we pass it at this scale. So making those little shadow changes, they wouldn't even be identifiable to the human eye. Okay. So when I bring back the mapping, we will have a sort of a broader scale that we are encouraging council to consider in terms of making these changes. Again, keeping in mind things like the forest conservation bylaw applies to features down to ½ an acre in size. We don't go below that. Also keeping in mind that there's lots of natural features on the landscape. I'm going to use a riparian meadow as the example. Across South Huron, where we have riparian meadows, sometimes we have floodways, but we also oftentimes have some pasture land. And you might be able to think of properties as you drive through the concessions where you do see sort of the flats being used as pasture land. To us, that is an agricultural use. It's also a natural environment area, but it would stay designated agriculture. So again, very much of a kind of a common sense approach to this work, and we're not looking to get down into those really fine details. It has absolutely no benefit. These are the types of changes I'm talking about making. So if we look at the top picture, that is the current official plan designation. When you compare that to the aerial imagery, what you'll see is sort of that long finger that used to extend out has since been removed, right? So over the years, there was removal of that, and it's an 8-acre difference. That is the type of mapping change that we're looking to make. Here's another example. It's a 5.5 acre difference. So we compare the current official plan designation mapping to the feature that now exists on the landscape. We can see that that feature has reduced between 2010 and 2020 by 5.5 acres in size. Now, sometimes one wonders, 5.5 acres, what happened to that 5.5 acres, right? Chances are we had some ash in that area. It was slowly removed. wanting to be clear, we are looking for the features that exist on the landscape. This is not an exercise to go through and sort of critique what has or hasn't been removed on the landscape. But I will say to council generally, the trend is that there has been some a more substantial level of removal. If you compare the 1999 aerials to present day, that owes to many factors, changing in crop practices, rising farmland values, Emerald Ash Borer has absolutely had the most significant impact in recent years. But yes, so what we would anticipate seeing likely is a net decrease in the amount of natural environment that's protected across South Huron. It's not ideal. It also speaks to the reasons why we need to have strong support for stewardship projects that help farmers voluntarily take on those stewardship projects that they want to do and that they feel are right for their properties. Okay. Last but not least, we're leaving the official plan and talking about the community improvement plan. So Selena had touched on this earlier, but council did direct that staff consult in addition to the official plan, also on ideas for a community improvement plan. So the 4 ideas were commercial facade improvement, energy efficiency, building renovation or repair, or additional residential unit. So I just picked 2 examples. These are not properties that would necessarily apply or have had an interest. But just to give you a sense of what the community said, there was certainly a lot of discussion about the potential in downtown Exeter, but also other downtowns that have existing commercial buildings that aren't currently being utilized. Could they be retrofitted for residential? So lots of interest in seeing that happen. Also wanting to keep our downtown spaces as vibrant as possible and recognizing that keeping people in a downtown is the best way to do that. The other one that came up that hadn't been considered was cultural heritage projects, thinking about ways of promoting sense of place. So it could be something around, maybe it's a interpretive plaques explaining, what was a property previously. Huron Park certainly comes to mind in terms of the rich military history in Huron Park. How could we do better at sort of celebrating some of the really unique areas in South Huron? But also thinking about really neat buildings on the landscape. And so I pulled the mill in Kirkton. I think that's a really neat building. It's one of the last ones, I'll be honest, as you drive around the county that you still see. It would be an opportunity to think about providing a grant to help keep that building up and also helping to provide that legibility, I think, about how agriculture was done in the past and maybe these types of uses we don't see many examples left. So just some ideas, some food for thought. No need for council to necessarily provide direction at this time. The goal is to provide you feedback. So again, there's no surprises when we again bring a draft community improvement plan. Our next steps. So Selena is actually heading out to the Kirkton Woodham Optimist Club here right shortly. We will be having a community table for the agricultural community, wanting to wait until after the planting season was done. And so we have been asking people sort of what would be the best way to go about that, if it would be virtual, if it would be in person. We've sort of received a bit of a mix in terms of response so far. I didn't know if any of the councillors have any insight or any recommendations as to how we can make that consultation most effective. We were thinking online might work for maybe some of the younger demographic. I don't know if there's maybe an older demographic that would prefer an in-person opportunity. I'm sort of looking at Councillor Oak, but I would have either Councillor Dietrich as well, if there's any input.
Go ahead, Councillor Oak.
Yeah, I still think in person is still the best way and maybe promoted with the OFA to try to direct, contact or direct they could help market the meeting to their membership for the area would be probably the one avenue. Now I know you're meeting with the Kirkton Optimists. There is a Kirkton Woodham farmers group as well. And so that's could be a start of the group that you contact as well, but I think the OFA would help to market that as well. One of the other suggestions I was going to make at the end here for input, I really appreciate you guys getting out to the farmers market. My suggestion is potentially going and having a table like that at the Kirkton Fair. It's early September. And there's a lot of people there that you could get feedback about it as well. I know Per South has a table there every year with different initiatives and things that they're working on, and I think that would be because there's a lot of people there on this. It's a Saturday morning would be the best time I would suggest, because the parade's there and then they have events and it's an all weekend event, but the Saturday morning would probably be the best to have something like that there where there's a lot of people that for feedback if we're at that point or whatever. So as another potential open house.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. The HCFA did put their ad in so the Rural Voice, the April edition did have sort of an attention South Huron farmers. The OP is being reviewed. So we've tried, we're going to continue to try to use those channels as much as possible. We also have just from working in the community, we definitely have a number of contacts of people who have said to us, I would be interested in participating. So certainly reaching out to folks that we know that are interested in this type of a conversation and asking them to sort of use their networks to get that word out as well. Okay.
There's also the Huron County Soil and Crop. That's their membership for South Huron farmers that they would have as well.
Yeah.
So if they're promoting a certain date.
Yeah, NFU, CFFO. Yep, for sure.
Yeah.
So we will be doing the agricultural table very imminently. And then the first draft is going to come out to council for the July 15th date. We will be doing a mail out in August. The direction there, we're looking to do a mail out to get the word out to people, in addition to using obviously social media and traditional newspaper print to let people know. The first draft is out, as well as those mail outs would advertise the open houses. So we do look to do the open houses the last week of August. Was the request of the Lakeshore community. The agricultural area is looking to get out early September. It would go first to help people before they're back on the land again, or in the middle, I guess. And then we'll do the rest of Exeter is anticipated to be later in September. The open houses, we don't anticipate going out to the same number of groups. We're thinking their documents will be available online. There are the open houses to have set times to come in and speak with staff. But there's certainly nothing that precludes someone from coming in at another time. We were also thinking of having some setups at the library where someone could go in, see a copy of the draft, and then there would be an opportunity for them to email in their thoughts. So those are the next steps of the process. Again, council can expect in July, it will be the full policy document with all of the changes noted, as well as all of the proposed mapping. Any questions as we wrap up?
Councillor Vaughn.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Want to talk about Centralia for a moment. Want to talk about the in the actual map. We have a company right now. Don't really want to highlight the company right now, but in sort of the southeastern portion of Centralia, there's a identifiable land as part of this settlement area. And then there's a blank space of land as you go farther south. And then you're met with the Dashwood Industries location, which I think is zoned as some kind of agricultural industrial park, urban agriculture. I don't know.
Rural industrial. Yeah.
Rural industrial. Okay. It has a very unique and so that piece of land between what is settlement area today and where Dashwood Industries is last year they were growing corn, and it's not part of the settlement area. And I'm just wondering why that is, like why we have a settlement area that's basically allowing and contemplating industry of a type, and then a blank farmland piece of land, and then the rural industrial. Are we looking at that the way that's laid out in that whole area? It just seems to me we have industry backing up against housing in a major way where it is today. And I always thought that it should be closer to the Dashwood industry. So are we looking at that?
Sorry, through the chair very quickly. Here's the current extent of the Centralia settlement area. So the southern boundary terminates here. This is the property that's had a recent planning application on it. And this is the Dashwood Industries property. And so there is this sort of land in between. So what's interesting is that the Dashwood Industries actually used to have their own sewage treatment plant. They had their own servicing set up for that property. So that's certainly something though we can look at from a wastewater perspective is would we be able to bring those lands online in terms of the additional lands here as well as Dashwood Industries property? My understanding is that they're not currently supported by the wastewater system. So I will have that confirmed by the Director of Development and other staff, and we'll bring that back.
Go ahead, Councillor Vaughn.
Thank you. And so I have another question too, which isn't around Centralia. It's moving back into the greater Grand Bend area that we're starting to talk about in those terms. So, okay, we're, you're contemplating having some further discussions with the Lambton Shores people in terms of, what their plans are. I know that they have just recently had an open house on their official plan. I don't know if it actually got passed, but they're a long ways ahead of where we are in terms of finishing up that plan. And I know that there's basically with this whole expansion, we're relying a lot on the economic community that Lambton Shores itself has created. To date, South Huron really hasn't put any money into that neck of the woods. A lot of the subdivisions around that whole area are managing themselves. Some of the infrastructure is South Huron. Some of the infrastructure is owned by the actual subdivisions. So it's kind of a mixed bag. The Tridon lands is the first time we're actually creating a brand new subdivision that's fully serviced, going to be fully serviced by South Huron when it's said and done. There's some missing elements in that subdivision as far as I'm concerned in terms of how to bring it into the whole Grand Bend walkability community kind of environment. There's a lot of gaps. And we're basically, as a South Huron community, going to attract new costs. So I'm over time, might not develop or have those costs now, but we're going to be adding services and hard infrastructure to our asset management plan. And the more we expand in that neighborhood, the more that phenomena will continue to grow. But there's a huge reliance on what's going on in Lambton Shores for those people to enjoy services. So I don't know how in-depth your conversation is going to be when you get around to Lambton Shores. If you're going to be talking about soft services, if you're going to be talking about medical, if you're going to be talking about community centers, I envision, and if I was sitting around the Lambton Shores Council table, I would be putting my hand out and asking South Huron for a big price ticket to handle the additional population that's about to come into that neighborhood. So I don't know how far you're going to take that, or if it's going to be left to councils to battle that out in the future.
This might defer to the CAO for this one. I would have some part of a question, but I think it might be appropriate for you to lead that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Mr. Nicholson, go ahead.
And that's fair enough. I'll be attending that meeting as well. So at this point, we haven't really scoped out the meeting. It started with the planners. And then now we've got a few of our senior staff going as well. Just to kind of start exploring those conversations. I think they have already been explored with previous councils and with previous administration at a high level. But here we are at having this discussion with our official plan and with theirs as well. And just to get kind of an idea. Yeah. What will the next steps be? I don't have an answer right now. But that is a consideration. Yes.
Well, I'm just, if I may make a comment, I just wanted to say I'm glad those conversations are happening. They're certainly happening a bit at the political level, at the elected official level in terms of sniping and why aren't you giving us some money for all these things that we have to put out for? So it's on my mind. And I know we have had our own budget, our own infrastructure, everything we want to pay for. That's been generally around the Exeter area, some of the hamlets, but the Grand Bend area, we've not been talking about that at a budget. This is a whole new territory and a whole new set of finances that is about to affect us and the future generations of us in terms of how are we going to afford divide and conquer two separate urban areas of substantial size. I'm concerned. So thanks.
Okay, any further questions or comments for Selena or Denise? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the recommendation. Ms. Cecilia Collison.
The South Huron Committee of the Whole receives a report and presentation of Selena McIntosh, planner, and Denise Van Amersfoort, manager of planning, regarding South Huron official plan 5-year review update for information.
Do I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Wendy McLeod Haggett, seconded by Councillor Dietrich. Any discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor? And that carries with 6-5. Got to do my math. Move on to item number 5. And Cecilia Collison, read the recommendation.
The South Huron Committee of the Whole does now adjourn at 6:04 p.m.
Okay, do I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Oak, seconded by Councillor Dietrich. All in favor? And that motion carries. Have a great night. Thanks, Denise.